The ear of corn lay in the dust where she had dropped it, half gnawed, the pale kernels gleaming like teeth in the afternoon sun. It was the only evidence that mattered. He had been tracking the rustle in his cornfield for the better part of an hour, expecting a coyote or maybe a stray buck. What he found, crouched at the edge of the rows, was a girl so slight she seemed woven from dust and shadow herself. His name, if he had one people used, had been lost to the trail years ago. In Redemption Creek, Nevada, in the summer of 1878, he was known only by the black stallion he rode and the deliberate quiet that clung to him like a second skin. He was the man who had bought the old Miller homestead, a place left to ruin, and had somehow coaxed life back into its tired soil. People left him be. A man with eyes like his, that seemed to measure distance and danger in the same glance, was not a man you bothered with small talk. His impossible position was that he had come to this place seeking silence, but the world insisted on making noise. And now, this. A thief. Not the hardened kind he was used to, with a gun on their hip and larceny in their heart. This was a Chinese girl, no more than 20, her black trousers and tunic smudged with the red dirt of his land. She stared up at him from beside his horse, her face a mask of terror, her hands empty except for the guilt that stained them. The social pressure in Redemption Creek was a palpable thing. The railroad had sliced through the territory, bringing with it gangs of Chinese laborers who lived in a makeshift camp on the far side of the town, a place most folks pretended didn't exist unless they needed someone to blame for missing laundry or a dry well. For him to be found with one of them, a thief caught on his land, was to invite a kind of trouble that couldn't be settled with a fast draw. He had caught her, and now he had to decide what justice looked like for a crime born of hunger. He swung down from his horse, the leather of his saddle creaking in the hot, still air. The girl flinched, scrambling back on her heels, ready to bolt. He didn't reach for the Colt Peacemaker at his hip. He didn't even look at it. Instead, he bent down and picked up the dropped ear of corn. He turned it over in his calloused hands, studying the small, desperate bites. He looked from the corn to her, and his voice, when it came, was lower than she expected, rough, like burlap. "You can't eat it like that," he said. "It's field corn, tough as a boot." He held out a hand, not in anger, but in invitation. She stared at it, at the scarred knuckles and the clean trimmed nails, a contradiction that spoke of a man who worked with his hands but hadn't let himself go wild. After a long moment, a silence stretched thin between the rustling corn stalks. She placed her small, trembling hand in his. He pulled her gently to her feet. The decision was made. He was taking her with him, and whatever storm that brought down on his head, he would have to face it. He led her back to the small clapboard house he'd repaired himself, the black stallion following behind like a loyal dog. The house was spare, almost empty, containing a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a cold stove. It was the home of a man who owned little because he expected to have to leave it all behind at a moment's notice. He gestured for her to sit at the table while he moved to the stove. He didn't speak again until he had a fire going, the smell of pine kindling filling the small room. He pulled a sack of potatoes from a bin, along with an onion and a slab of salted pork. He began to cut them with a practiced efficiency, the knife moving with a quiet confidence. She watched him, her fear slowly giving way to a profound confusion. She had expected a beating, or to be dragged to the town marshal. She had prepared herself for the shouts, the spit, the blind anger that followed her people everywhere in this golden land. She had not expected this quiet, methodical charity. He worked without looking at her, yet she felt his awareness of her in the room, a steady, unthreatening presence. Soon, the smell of frying pork and potatoes filled the air, a scent so rich and comforting it made her stomach ache with a hunger that was deeper than just the lack of food. He slid a plate piled high with food in front of her, then sat opposite with his own. He ate without a word, his gaze fixed on his plate. Hesitantly, she picked up the fork. The first bite was an explosion of flavor and warmth. She ate quickly, ravenously, and when she was done, he pushed his own half-finished plate toward her. She looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time. They were a pale, washed-out blue, the color of a winter sky, and they held no judgment she could see. There was only a deep, abiding weariness. She finished his plate, too. Therefore, when the sound of an approaching wagon broke the afternoon quiet, a knot of cold dread formed in her belly. The gunslinger didn't seem surprised. He simply rose, took their empty plates to the wash basin, and moved to the doorway, blocking it with his frame. Silas Croft's supply wagon pulled up, pulled by two tired-looking mules. Croft was a man who owned the general store, half the town's deeds, and an opinion on everything. He was a pillar of Redemption Creek, which meant he was a man whose weight could crush smaller people. "Afternoon," Croft called out, his voice a little too loud, a little too friendly. He didn't get down from the wagon. "Just making my rounds. Saw you had company." His eyes flickered past the gunslinger's shoulder, landing on the girl at the table. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face. It was not a kind expression. "She was hungry," the gunslinger said. It wasn't an excuse. It was a statement of fact. "Hungry for your corn, I hear," Croft said, his smile tightening. "Word gets around. A Chinaman's girl caught stealing on your property." The gunslinger's shoulders didn't move, but something in his posture hardened. "She's fed now. The matter's closed." "Is it?" Croft clucked his tongue. "See, the folks in town, they might see it different. They might see you harboring a thief. Gets people talking. Gets people nervous. We got enough trouble with that railroad camp without folks thinking they can just take what they want." He was speaking to the gunslinger, but his words were meant for the whole valley. It was a public confrontation, delivered from the seat of his wagon. But the gunslinger didn't rise to the bait. He just stood there, a silent wall of a man. "The matter," he repeated, his voice dropping half an octave, "is closed, Silas." Croft held his gaze for a long moment. He was a man used to getting his way through pressure and insinuation. He wasn't used to meeting a rock he couldn't push. Therefore, he changed his tactic. "Fine, have it your way." He snapped the reins and the wagon lurched forward. "But don't come crying to me when you find more of 'em in your field. Or in your house." The threat hung in the air long after the wagon's dust had settled. The gunslinger turned back into the room. The girl, whose name he still didn't know, had her head bowed. He expected tears, but when she looked up, her eyes were clear. She gestured toward the door, then to herself, a question in her expression. He understood. She was asking if she should leave. He shook his head once. Not yet. He walked out toward the small corral where he kept his stallion and a spare mare. The mare was favoring her front left leg, a slight limp he'd been watching for a few days. He was checking the hoof when he felt a presence beside him. It was the girl. She pointed to the mare's leg, then to a patch of broad-leafed weeds growing near the fence line. She mimed crushing the leaves and applying them to the horse's knee. He watched her, skeptical but curious. She moved with a quiet certainty, gathering the plants, then using a smooth rock to mash them into a green, fragrant pulp against a piece of scrap wood. She approached the mare slowly, speaking to it in a soft, melodic language he didn't understand. The horse, usually skittish with strangers, stood perfectly still as she gently applied the poultice to the swollen joint, then wrapped it with a strip of cloth torn from her own tunic. He was stunned. He had seen her as a frightened child, a victim of circumstance. But this was something else. This was competence. This was a knowledge he didn't possess. She met his gaze and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if to say, "It will work." In that moment, his reading of her shifted entirely. She wasn't just a thief. She was a survivor, with skills forged in a world he knew nothing about. The surface conflict with Croft seemed to have passed, but as dusk began to bleed across the sky, he saw two riders approaching from the direction of town. He recognized Croft's ranch hands. They weren't coming for a friendly chat. He had handled Croft for now, but he was about to find out that a man's wounded pride was a more dangerous thing than his fists, and Silas Croft had an abundance of both. The two ranch hands reined in their horses a dozen yards from the porch, staying just outside the comfortable range of a pistol. They didn't dismount. The taller one, a man with a sun-scorched face named Jeb, acted as spokesman. "Croft sent us," he said, his voice flat. "He's concerned about his property." "I don't have any of his property," the gunslinger replied, his tone just as level. He remained on the porch, not moving toward the gun at his hip, but perfectly balanced on the balls of his feet. The girl was inside, out of sight. "He ain't talking about supplies," Jeb said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "He's talking about the girl. Says she's a thief. Says it ain't right for her to be here. He wants her brought to town." "She's under my roof," the gunslinger said. "She stays." The second rider, a younger man with nervous eyes, shifted in his saddle. This wasn't what they had signed on for. Confronting the quiet man from the Miller place was proving to be as unsettling as the rumors suggested. "Now look," Jeb pressed, trying to sound reasonable. "Nobody wants trouble, but the whole town's riled up. You keeping her here, it's like you're siding with them against us. It ain't natural." The gunslinger took one deliberate step forward, off the porch and into the yard. The movement was small, but it changed the geometry of the confrontation entirely. "I'm not siding with anyone," he said, his voice carrying in the evening air. "I'm telling you to get off my land." For a moment, nobody moved. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows. Jeb's hand twitched, hovering near his own sidearm. It was the moment of decision. The gunslinger didn't flinch. He just watched, his pale eyes seeming to absorb the last of the light. He wasn't threatening them, not with words. He was simply presenting them with a fact as solid as the mountains behind him. To get to the girl, they would have to go through him. And they suddenly found themselves unwilling to pay that price. Jeb cursed under his breath, yanked his horse's reins, and wheeled the animal around. The younger man followed without a word. They rode off, leaving only dust and a tense silence in their wake. Later that night, they sat on the porch as darkness settled completely. The air cooled, carrying the scent of sagebrush and dry earth. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The vast, starry sky of the Nevada Territory arched over them, indifferent and immense. "They will be back," she said. Her English was perfect, unaccented, and it startled him more than a gunshot would have. He turned to look at her. In the dim light from the open doorway, her face was calm, her earlier fear replaced by a quiet resignation. "You speak English," he stated, the surprise evident in his voice. "My mother was a missionary's daughter," she explained. "She taught me. She believed it would be my shield in this country." She gave a small, sad smile. "She was a very hopeful woman." He absorbed this new information. "What is your name?" "May," she said. "May," he repeated softly. "Why were you in my cornfield, May?" She looked away, out at the dark line of the mountains. "My father, he helped build the railroad. He was a blaster. There was an accident 3 months ago, a premature explosion. He was hurt badly, his leg. She paused. The company doctor said there was nothing to be done. They gave him a few dollars and told him to leave the camp. But he cannot walk. We have nothing. She reached into a small pouch at her waist and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a letter, the creases worn soft and gray from countless readings. This is from him, before the accident. She unfolded it carefully. He wrote of this place, this mountain of gold. He believed we could build a life here, a small farm maybe. He said the soil was good. Her voice trembled for the first time. The medicine for the pain. The man in town who sells it, it costs $2 a bottle. I earn 20 cents a day washing for the saloon. She didn't need to say anything more. The arithmetic was brutal and simple. He understood now. It wasn't theft. It was a daughter's desperate attempt to ease her father's suffering. He was quiet for a long time, the crickets providing the only sound. "Croft," he said finally, "does he own the land your camp is on?" She nodded. "He lets us stay for a fee, a portion of what everyone earns. But since the accident, many men are hurt or have left. The payments are short. He has been looking for a reason to clear the land." And now Croft had his reason. A thief from the camp, harbored by an outsider. It was the perfect excuse. What had started as a girl stealing an ear of corn had become something much larger and more dangerous. It was about land and money and the power to erase people who had become inconvenient. The next morning, a notice was posted on the door of the general store. It was a formal territorial eviction order, citing a violation of the lease agreement and the harboring of a criminal element. The entire Chinese camp was given 48 hours to vacate Silas Croft's property. A crowd had gathered, reading the notice with a mixture of grim satisfaction and nervous apprehension. This was an escalation, a move that could easily spill into violence. The gunslinger now faced a choice that would define him and Redemption Creek forever. He could send May away, back to her people. He could ride out himself, disappearing as quietly as he had arrived, leaving the town to its ugly business. It was the safe choice, the sensible one. It was the choice the man he used to be would have made without a second thought. But looking at May as she stood by his corral that morning, checking the poultice on the mare's leg, which was already visibly less swollen, he knew he couldn't. Her quiet dignity, her fierce loyalty to her father, had touched something in him he thought was long dead. He made his decision. It cost him the one thing he had come to this valley to find, his anonymity. He saddled his black stallion, but instead of riding for the hills, he rode directly into town. He didn't have his gun belt on. In its place, he carried a worn leather satchel. He was not going to fight Croft with bullets. He was going to fight him with the law. By the time the first autumn chill settled in the valley 3 months later, Redemption Creek was a different place. The gunslinger, whose name the town now knew was Elias Thorne, had walked into the territorial clerk's office that day and unrolled a set of survey maps that were more accurate than anything the county owned. In his satchel were land deeds and federal homestead claim filings. It turned out Elias Thorne was not just a drifter with a fast gun. In a life he never spoke of, he had been a surveyor for the Union Pacific Railroad, a man who understood the intricate and often abused laws of land acquisition in the territories. He had challenged Silas Croft's claim to the land the camp was on, proving in front of the circuit judge that Croft's deed was based on a fraudulent survey marker. The eviction notice was nullified. Croft, exposed and humiliated, found his influence in the town wither like a vine cut at the root. The railroad, needing to acquire right-of-way for a new spur line, ended up bypassing Croft and dealing directly with Elias. He negotiated a fair price for the land, with a binding addendum that the current residents of the camp be given legal title to a small, permanent section of their own, complete with water rights. That wasn't all. Elias had sent a telegraph from the station office, a long and detailed message to a former associate in San Francisco who now worked as a lawyer for the Central Pacific. He laid out the case of the injured workers, May's father among them. Weeks later, a representative from the railroad arrived, not with threats, but with a settlement. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough for medicine, for food, and for the quiet dignity of not being forgotten. May's father began to recover, and May herself, she had transformed a barren quarter-acre of Elias's land next to the creek into a thriving market garden. Using seeds she had carefully carried from her home across the ocean, she grew greens and melons the likes of which Redemption Creek had never seen. Twice a week she would load a small cart, one Elias had built for her, and sell her produce in town. At first people were hesitant, but the quality of her vegetables spoke for itself, and soon her cart became a regular stop. The whispers about the Chinese thief were replaced by conversations about May's melons. The community's judgment, once so swift and harsh, had been quietly, concretely reversed. One evening in late September, they worked together, harvesting the last of his corn before the frost could claim it. The air was crisp and clean. Elias moved down the rows, his movements sure and steady. He had filled his basket and was starting on another when he saw May watching him, a small smile on her face. He stopped, pulled a full, heavy ear from its stalk, and peeled back the dry, rustling husk. The kernels were a deep, rich gold, hardened for grinding into meal. He walked over to her and held it out. She took it from his hand, her fingers brushing against his. She didn't bite into it this time. She held it as if it were a treasure, a symbol of the harvest, of a home, of a future that had once seemed impossible. They stood there for a moment in the fading light, the scent of the earth rising around them, partners in a life they had built not from violence or fear, but from a shared and stubborn decency. A man's reputation, Elias had learned, is just the story other people tell about him. It's a flimsy thing, easily torn. But his character, that's the story he writes himself, day by day, harvest by harvest, in the choices he makes when no one is looking, and in the ones he makes when everyone is. And in the quiet of that Nevada evening, his story was finally, truly his own.